You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back for another week. We actually get to talk some football this week. Well, partially. And then we'll get to really talk football in the coming weeks now that spring camp is upon us. So let's get going. We're going to do a little look at postseason basketball for Utah, a take on the Red Rocks and their postseason, and then we're going to finish with a look at the top storylines ahead of Utah's start to spring camp this week. So let's jump right into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way, because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, we're going to jump into this like we usually do, and we're going to get after basketball. It's March. It's March Madness. Unfortunately for Utah, there's just not a lot to talk about for March Madness, especially on the men's side. The men obviously did not qualify for the NCAA tournament. A big surprise. I'm sorry to break that to you here on this Wednesday afternoon that I'm recording this, but no, the men will not be anywhere near the NCAA tournament or any other postseason tournament. It's over for them. So, not a big surprise. Last episode we talked about, potential transfer portal moves. Surprise, surprise. 2 players entered the portal. It was Ja'Kai Howard and Chapa. Now I'm blanking his name. He just left so fast. Chapa. Anyways, I can't remember his last name. That's how impactful it was, his short tenure for Utah. Anyways, those 2 left the program early on and are now officially in the portal. Just another breaking news moment. But, look, this is the time for the men's side to really start focusing on the transition to the next year. You're going to have, an off season where the transfer portal is going to open up here soon. This is where Alex gets his opportunity to really invest in the players that he wants to come back, but also at the same time look for other players around the country that he may be interested in getting. So there's going to be a lot of movement here, right? Like we went through that last week, and you can get back on last week to see kind of my thoughts on who will enter the portal, who could be coming back. It's still a fluid situation. There's not much that's necessarily changed as of right now, but the men's basketball side will be sitting on the sidelines watching March Madness unfold. Thursday, obviously, is the beginning of that. This is the best 2 days of sport, in my opinion, just getting to watch all these fun games and being able to see if the David can beat the Goliath type situations with these underseeded teams trying to go for it. But once again, Utah will not be there for, I think it's almost the 10th season now. I think that's correct. I'm trying to remember the last time I saw Utah go to the NCAA tournament. I think I sat courtside as Domantas Sabonis decided to destroy Jakob Poeltl. Again, not a great memory for you, but it was fun nonetheless. Future NBA player, like both are, but we're gonna move on. Women's side now. The women's accepted a invitation to the Women's Basketball Invitational Tournament. So this is equivalent to the NIT and the men's. And so the women's, they were on the bubble. We talked about this. They were on the bubble and just weren't able to get enough, especially down the stretch, to be able to push them over the edge to get into the NCAA tournament. But if you believe what people say, they were probably one of the first 4 out. And so that's, a tough spot to be because you were close, but at the same time, you weren't close enough. And so it's a tough position to be because everybody wants to be in the NCAA tournament. That would have been the 5th straight season for Utah. But instead, I think, the WBIT is actually going to be a good opportunity for this team. It allows players to be able to, get some postseason opportunities to kind of continue their career. It helps some of the younger players kind of continue to develop in more of a postseason atmosphere. And Utah goes into this being one of the 4 1 seeds. And so Utah, even though they're being a 1 seed, usually that team hosts the first round game. Unfortunately for Utah, there was a scheduling conflict, and it was just kind of a difficult situation for Utah to host this first game against Eastern Kentucky. So tomorrow, Thursday, if you're listening to this on Wednesday, the Utes will be playing at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Time. That'll be on ESPN Plus, where you can go watch that as normal. Should they win that game against Eastern Kentucky, there is the likely possibility, is what I've heard, is that they will host that second game. So that would be most likely Sunday. And so if you're into watching women's basketball and that's who you've supported all season, there's an opportunity to go see them again in postseason play before they try to make it to Wichita, Kansas for the end goal. Right, that's where the championship games and the semifinals will all be played. So the end goal here is Wichita, trying to get there for the women's side. And really, you're just looking to try to kind of get some more experience, right? Trying to give Lonnie White, Maddie Wilkie, Sam Crisp, these players that have been on the team for a little bit, some opportunities to, continue their career before moving on into whatever ventures they want. Some may continue to try to pursue professional basketball. Others may, just transition into regular life. So we'll see what happens there, but this is a good opportunity for this team. It's a good opportunity for Gavin Peterson to continue to establish his identity with some of these players and try to get them to come back, assuming that some of them want to come back. And then it turns to roster building, right? And that's the name of the game. So really curious to see how this goes, on the men's and women's side, just how they rebuild these rosters, what moves forward. But the men have a jump start on that simply because they're not included, and then the women, it'll just be whenever they lose. So we'll see what happens there. So let's transition a bit to the Red Rocks. The Red Rocks are also entering their postseason play. But before I get into that, and this isn't earth-shattering, it's not breaking news, this isn't even necessarily a hot take, although some may consider it a hot take because everything about this is a hot take to some people. But I think, and we knew this from the very beginning, but the move to the Big 12 for the for Utah, I would argue that the Red Rocks were hurt the most. And this is where, the struggles are going to come. Now, you can argue, football obviously needs to be in a better situation in terms of what they feel in terms of the next evolution of conference realignment, right? The Big Two, the Power Two, whatever you want to call it. Utah wants to be included in that because that's where the money is, and quite honestly, that's where the athletic departments are going to get their money. So you do need to have the money, right? And so Utah is going to set itself up on the football side for wherever they can get that. And obviously, it's not been shy that their goal is to be able to get to the Big Ten, right? That seems to be the most fit. That's where there's been a lot of conversations. I know a lot of people in the Big 12 take that as a slight, and you can take it for what it is. I would argue, and this is maybe more the hot take as a total side tangent to this Red Rocks conversation. Utah football is better served right now in the Big 12 in terms of the level of competition. And so I think this is one of the greatest opportunities for Utah to kind of hone in and develop and grow and show that you can compete on a Big 10 level, essentially, right? Like, you've got to have the money, you've got to do that, but you've got to be able to do that first in the Big 12, or else you are going to fall by the wayside, right? Like, you can't go in there expecting to be Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, and expect to compete if you're not really willing to kind of put in those resources. And obviously, we've gone over Taylor Randall's vision of kind of transitioning Utah into a higher level, but at the same time, this isn't necessarily something that Utah fits right now. So, football aside, the Red Rocks are the team that are hurt the most by being in the Big 12. And as much as, that can sound like a slight to the Big 12, the reality is gymnastics, it just doesn't have the same cachet as maybe some of the others. Obviously, basketball is a great conference for the Big 12, right? Football, you can argue with some of the things that are there, right? Like, the level of competition may not be the same at the top tier elite as the Pac-12, but in gymnastics, it's Utah and then everybody else. And it's clear, right? Like, coming into the Big 12 championship this weekend, it would be Utah having a bad day for them not to win this championship. And that's kind of the expectation. And that's good, right? Like, it allows Utah to continue to stack championships. You're the regular season championship. You go undefeated in, the regular season. You're expected to go compete again there, but there's no real advantage to be able to compete in the Big 12 as a member of the Red Rocks because you're not getting that same level of competition. I've talked about it earlier this year with, the competition against Iowa State. There's competition against Denver. There's issues with some of the equipment, right? Like this isn't just the same level. Meanwhile, this last week you go compete with UCLA and it's a completely different environment. And sure, both of these programs are rivals and they've been that way for a long time. And there's some history there because of their time in the Pac-12 and beyond. But this is more akin to who the Red Rocks are, right? Just pulling kind of the numbers here. And for anybody that doesn't understand gymnastics, I'll try my best to kind of explain this a little bit. But Utah here, their average score, or we'll go with the NQS score, that's basically the rating system that gymnastics officially uses to seed teams to regionals. What it does is it essentially takes the 9 best scores from the season broken up between away meets and home meets and tries to kind of average out a record amongst everybody else. So you're ranked according to how well your meets have been all season. Seems kind of a great opportunity, right? And by all accounts, from scoring advantages, this has been a down season for the Red Rocks. It hasn't been a great season. That's not to say it hasn't been a good season. It just hasn't had the same highs that they've had in years past. And so considering that this is a down season, the Red Rocks' NQS is a 197, essentially flat. Like it's just a tiny bit above that, but a 197. That's still a really solid score. But the Red Rocks are usually, especially when you get to postseason or getting close to postseason, are closer to 198s. They're closer to 197, high 197s, right? That's an accumulation of all the scores throughout the meet, if you didn't know that. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is so Utah's NQS on their down year is a 197. The next closest is number 23 Denver at 196.36, BYU at number 24 at a 196.23. And BYU's actually had a really solid season compared to where they've been historically. Arizona State are in the 195s. West Virginia, 194. That's almost a 195. Those are your teams, right? Like, that's it. And so, by and large, the Red Rocks, even on a down year, are roughly a whole point better, which is a pretty significant margin in gymnastics, a whole point better than their next closest competitor. It gets even worse the lower you go. And look, the whole league isn't going to be similar, but you want to be able to have similar teams that can allow you to compete, right? You want to push yourself and be able to drive yourself. Because in gymnastics, you're not necessarily competing against other teams. You are, but you're competing against yourself. But there's some kind of advantage in terms of being able to compete with some of the top teams in the country because you get to see it at a different stage, right? You're getting the pressure of, okay, we can do this on the beam, but if we do this, then we can win the meet, right? And so there's like these internal things where you're mostly checking in on yourselves and it's more of mental because you know how to do the gymnastics, but it's not quite completely ignoring your opponent, right? Normally, in a meet like last week with UCLA and Utah, there's going to be a lot of tough competition. That's what it was going in halfway through the meet. And, Utah had a slip up and had an injury and it suddenly kind of changed some stuff. But at the same time, this was kind of where the team is, where they can compete, right? They were next level with UCLA, which is ranked number 5 in the country. That's usually around where Utah is. And so they had an opportunity to kind of have that level of competition. And unfortunately, Utah just hasn't had that same level. For example, UCLA's NQS is a 197.478. Excuse me, I just dropped something. That's my fault. I shouldn't be playing with stuff as I talk. So their NQS is a 197.478. Their high is a 198.15, which is closer to what the Red Rocks perform. Now, we get it. UCLA's been a great gymnastics program forever. Jordan Childs is on the team, as well as many other great talented gymnasts. But looking at the Pac-12, and I'm not saying the Pac-12 was some grand conference for gymnastics, but it was far more competitive than what Utah has right now. this is where it's at right now. Stanford, which is having a stellar season, so this wasn't necessarily them in most years, but Stanford, number 7, their NQS is a 197.267, so above Utah right now. Number 14, California, 196.698, so just barely below Utah, but they're in competition with Utah, and they've been in competition with Utah for quite a while, so you're pretty equally aligned right there. And then the bottom of the Pac-12, the former Pac-12 here, outside of Arizona State, is Oregon State, and they're a 196. So they were at the bottom. Obviously, they were better when they had, a former Olympian on there, but those were your levels of competition. It still wasn't the same level as the SEC, right? Like, we get that. The SEC has kind of transitioned to be the best in gymnastics, but you're getting hurt by being in the Big 12. And that's been the problem is you can't see that opportunity available to you because you're not competing with those same level teams. And so maybe, it's in basketball or even in football, you talk a lot of times about playing down to your opponent. And I don't think the Red Rocks are necessarily doing that, but I think when you go into the mindset every single week that you're going to be better than the teams pretty consistently, even without trying. I mean, their meet against Iowa State this year, which was probably one of the worst disasters that the Red Rocks have had all year, they still won by a pretty comfortable margin, and they scored in the 195s. Like, that kind of shows like where this team has been and what it can be, right? And I think there's just kind of like that mental edge that allows you to be able to say, hey, we've got to be on our top game this week, forces you, instead of going through this middling, conference league that just doesn't really give you this competition, and then suddenly you get into postseason play in terms of regionals and the nationals, and now you're not necessarily prepared for that, right? You're not in a situation where you're, the iron sharpens iron type situation. Like, you're not there. You're now suddenly steps behind, and yeah, your gymnastics are just as good as Oklahoma or LSU or UCLA, but at the same time, you're not living up to those expectations because you're just not seeing it every single day. So, look, this isn't, a lot to say anything other than I feel like the Red Rocks deserve to be able to have a better destination. And this is one of the teams especially where I feel like if you could break apart and just be a non-member of the Big 12 and kind of go your own way, whether that's independence, I think independence is tough. But if you could find a way to get included into another conference, even though still being a Big 12 member as the rest of the programs, this is the team that needs to do it. So we'll see. It's not an easy situation. I don't think there's any appetite for that to happen. But at the same time, I think, you've got to look at where the Red Rocks are at, and I think this is a tough situation for them. Scheduling is getting tough. You're not getting great competition in terms of the Big 12, and it's tougher to get some of these SEC teams to come compete with you, or the Big 10, because, one, they have a tough competition in the SEC, so why do they want to add another tough competitor in Utah who, has 10 national championships, recruits at the highest level with these guys? Like, it's not worth competing with them outside of ESPN having their, collegiate quad meets and that kind of stuff. Like, there's no advantage to a lot of these schools to be able to schedule a Utah where you could lose. And so Utah's in this really tricky spot where they don't have the level of competition in conference, but they don't get that opportunity to compete with other teams around the country because you don't want to be with like-minded teams. And so this is a tough spot for them. So with all that said, the Red Rocks do have their Big 12 championship on Saturday. It starts at 5 p.m. at the Maverick Center. So, if you're available and you want to go, that's a great opportunity to see the Red Rocks one last time before they go into regionals. And, if luck is on their side and they're able to compete at the level that they need to, move on from regionals and get to nationals again, which, has happened every single year that nationals has been around. So would be a great opportunity for them. But, we'll see. We'll see what happens. So this Saturday, Utah will be in Olympic order. What that means is they will start on vault, then go to bars, then beam, and then end on floor, which is a pretty solid lineup for the Red Rocks. I think it bodes well for them. Beam has been a little up and down this year, but we'll see. They had 3 gymnasts that were out last week for sickness, so you should get them back, and I think that puts Utah at full strength where, quite honestly, they can compete for a 198 score, right? And a high score here, and I haven't done the math yet to figure out exactly what they would need to get all these scenarios, but they can get as high as ranked 9th in the country with a good score here, and then get as low as 13th. So slip one spot to where there are actually two spots. One spot, two spots, I can't remember, from where they're at. But there's, what that means is essentially where you're going to be slated into regionals. And so it's important for the Red Rocks to kind of get the most advantageous regional possible. But right now there's a lot of fluidity there. I cannot make a flowchart for this one. We're not going to do that. So that's kind of where they're at. But, this is your last opportunity to see the Red Rocks this season before they go into regionals. So there is that. Let's jump into football. So tomorrow, Thursday, the U is going to be hosting their pro day, and this is the first year in the Big 12 for Utah where they haven't had to go down to Texas and be a part of the Big 12's full team pro day. I haven't heard from them specifically, but it probably didn't go as well as they were hoping. We're learning there's a few things like that's happened, aka glass court. We'll leave that one there. But Utah will be hosting their own pro day tomorrow morning. So there's going to be a lot of scouts here in attendance. There's going to be a lot of the former athletes that are trying to get to the NFL who are going to try to make a name for themselves, right? We obviously saw 5 players from Utah compete at the NFL Combine. And by saying compete, 3 actually participated in the drills, whereas 2, Lander Barton and Logan Fano, actually did not compete. They just went through interviews and different things that way. So really curious to see if they go through some drills here in Utah. My understanding is they will, but we'll see, kind of what that means for them. There's not a lot of officiality to a lot of this, unless Morgan Scally wants to do things differently and give us kind of some updates. A lot of it is just kind of chaos, right? It's underwear Olympics with not a lot of officiality to it in terms of what we know or what we can report. So it's really just more for the scouts of all these NFL teams to kind of show up and see these players in person, get another look at some players, kind of give their one last look before they go through more interviews and kind of finalize their draft boards going into April. So Spencer Fano, Caleb Lomu, I can't imagine is going to do anything. They did enough at the NFL Combine. There could be a situation where Spencer tries to prove a little bit more simply because some of his measurables weren't up to the standard that many NFL teams have for an offensive tackle, but there's not something you can do about your physical stature, right? You can't suddenly grow 3 inches in your arms. Like your hands can't suddenly get bigger. So, I don't think there's going to be a situation where those two compete in anything, but there could be a chance depending on what's there. Also, it could be the scouts want to see something. So I think, you'll have those guys available, but for the most part, the 2 guys from the NFL Combine group would be Lander Barton and Logan Fano that are going to want to participate tomorrow. And then Steve Bartle, my coworker, reported yesterday that Brant Keithy will be participating. I know there's been some back and forth on this where there's some people that say it's not actually happening. My understanding is that, he's got everything ready, and he is expected to participate, but we'll see. I think he'd be smart too, to be able to give it one last chance, knowing that last year he was injured and didn't really have a true opportunity to kind of do that. So curious to see what happens. I think good for him if he can get any opportunities available to him. I think it would be a great opportunity for him just to be able to test the market and see what he can do. Try to get back, or not try to get back, but try to get as much access to the NFL as possible. And if it doesn't work out, I think, he's content with that, knowing that he had to do that this last year. But I think you want to give it one last try and see what you can do. So really curious to see what happens with Brant, assuming that he does actually participate, but we'll see. Some other former players that I'm interested in seeing. Some of these may not have NFL opportunities. Some may be on the fringe. Some may get drafted. Some may be undrafted free agents. I think it just depends on kind of what they can show and what they can do. But they've got an uphill climb simply because they weren't invited to the NFL Combine, which means they probably have a little bit more work to do. So those players include Ryan Davis. I know he's been working really hard to be able to get there. I think, he can showcase his ability, kind of be a Britton Covey type player in the league and kind of showcase his ability, but curious to see there. Blake Cotton, I think he showed a lot in 1 year with Utah. The unfortunate part is that he was only at Utah for 1 year. So I think had Cotton been at Utah for 2 years, I think he's much more of a look for the NFL to be able to say, hey, I think he can do this at the highest level. But I'm really fascinated with him because I think he has shown an ability to be able to do that at the highest level. It's just, where is it going to go? So I'm curious to see, how he tests, what happens there. But I think he's a guy that you can pay attention to, and whether he gets drafted or not, I think he's going to have a chance to be able to make an NFL roster. And then once he's got his foot in the door, I think he's at least in contention for a 53-man roster. Whether he makes that or not, I think the goal there would be a minimum practice squad, right? And then be able to kind of keep moving along there, and I think he's got potential to do that. Then there's some other players where, whether it's injuries, whether it's age, whether it's just kind of factors that don't necessarily help them get into the draft, it's going to be Levani Damuni and Jaron Kump. Both are older players. Both have had injury history, but there's potential where maybe either one of them or both of them could find a spot on a roster. I'm assuming free agency. I can't imagine a world where either one of those guys gets drafted, but you never really know, and it depends on how they test. And then there's Michael Mokafisi and Akari Rogers. Both players, I think, can be on that bubble as well and kind of show some stuff. But it's an uphill climb for a lot of these guys, and I think that's what this day for Pro Day is going to be all about. And we're going to see what happens there. But I think, there's definitely some talent coming out of Utah, not even including the guys that were included in the NFL Combine. But it's, this is their day. This is their opportunity to showcase it, and we'll see what happens with them. So I'll give some updates as best as possible tomorrow as I head up to Pro Day and see what we can report. Sometimes it's better than others, and sometimes it's just standing around watching a lot of nothing, and we don't really get anything out of it. So I'll do my best, but it's hard. All right, also tomorrow, spring camp starts. So the football team, they've been going through conditioning, and they have like one-off practices periodically each week. But this is now their opportunity to go through spring camp, where you get 15 practices throughout the whole spring camp to be able to prepare for the fall, right? And this is a great opportunity to kind of go through your depth, to shore up certain things with offensive schemes, defensive schemes, kind of install some of these things early to help the players understand as they go into the offseason and work by themselves what they can do. And so this is a pivotal time. Now, ahead of this, Morgan Scalley invited the media to an event that was totally off the record, so I can't really get into specifics of it. But we got an opportunity to kind of see how he digests things and kind of approaches things. And I'm really fascinated to see how this works, because in just the little bit of time that we got to spend with him, and he went through, some plays and talked through certain things to kind of help us understand what he looks at as a coach and kind of how he does things. It's clear that he's a great teacher. I think anybody that understands who Morgan Scalley is understands that he just has a knack for speaking. He can remember a million things, and so it's easy for him to recite certain things and have this passion because it's just all there in his brain. And so I'm curious to see how that translates to the field. It's obvious in watching him that he's a brilliant mind in football. And most of these guys are, right? Like, I don't want to take anything away from anybody else, but I think Scalley, watching him firsthand like that was eye-opening. Us as media were talking, a little bit about how intriguing it was, because you realize like how little about football you actually know. And these guys have so much more knowledge than I'll ever forget, right? Or they'll forget, whatever that saying is, you know what I'm saying? There's just a tremendous amount of knowledge. And I think as part of that, he's very personable. He's intelligent. He's innovative. There's a lot of things that come out as part of that, where me not giving away specifics kind of shows that there's a lot of things going on in his mind, but it's not all football, right? I think he genuinely cares about people as individuals, and that comes out in how he approaches people, right? He doesn't have to do anything for us as media, right? Like, obviously you have to have a good connection with media to be able to kind of do what you need to do. And if you're I don't want to say if the media is on your side, because that's not really our job, but if you have a good working relationship with the media, it's so much better for your program, because then we're writing positive stories about your program. And it helps that you win, right? But it's easier than being adversarial to the media and being difficult to work with and shutting us down in every situation, because we have a mouthpiece as well, right? And an opportunity for us to come out there and say, hey, this is what's going on. This isn't working, that kind of stuff. And I don't think he's doing that in a means of trying to get on our good side. I think he just genuinely cares about relationships and wanting to make sure that everybody understands what he's doing. And there's going to be things that we don't understand as a fan, as a media member, as any outside observer. There's going to be things that we don't understand about how he approaches stuff. But it's clear that he sees that, he recognizes it, and there's things that he tries to change. There's things that that are key to his identity that he's going to continue to do, right? Even if there is people that are frustrated with it. Now, I don't think there's anything as it relates to that's happening that he's just, stubborn and doing. But the point is, he's got a vision, and he's going to do that, and he's going to follow through with it. But at the same time, he's open and receptive to other people. One of his key tenets is he wants to be able to be taught, right? And as the head coach, he's not above learning from other people. He recognizes that there's so many things to learn from other people, and he doesn't have all the answers. Now, with that said, there's many things about how he wants to approach the innovative side of things that I'm really fascinated by. And I can't really speak to that because that was part of that off-the-record stuff. But I know that he's thinking at a level that it's not like it's like some brand new, like how suddenly he's going to change the game per se. But I think it's ways that he's attacking it in a way that maybe goes against the standard operation of how a football team would operate on certain plays, right? There may be a play where it's like in a standard situation, maybe this is how you do it. This is how Utah is going to try to get an edge by doing X, Y, Z. And so I think that's where he's coming at in terms of attacking it, but it's not, look, in football, like any little minor edge that you can get can sometimes be huge. And I think that's where he's approaching this, is he's trying to find any little edge that he can get while still trying to be personable, while still trying to connect with people and trying to make sure that everybody understands in little part what he's doing. And I think so far it's working. I mean, I think the media left impressed with kind of how he operates. And look, this isn't like some unknown that other coaches don't do around the country. I mean, obviously Kyle Whittingham was much more, I'm a football coach and I just do it. I don't need to really care about others. I mean, that's probably a more simplified approach to that. But I think Scally wants you included because he wants investment into the program. And if you can get invested into the program, it's much easier for you to understand what they're doing. And so I think that's kind of where this is coming from. And I'm really fascinated to see how this goes, because I think he's just trying to operate in a multi-dimensional world, right? Like he's trying to find how to be the best football coach and understand the best things that he can do, trying to delegate to certain people, trying to be personable to other people and actually be committed to them, and trying to get people interested in the program organically as well as through winning. And I think, I'm really curious to see how that's all going to come together, because I think he's won over a lot of people, right? And results on the field have to speak for themselves. And so that's where the next level here is. But for me, I'm really curious how that translates now into spring. I think there's been, I wouldn't even call it a revitalization with Utah, but I think it's a different feel and vibe with this team in terms of kind of the opportunities available. Kyle did speak about, goals that he had, but Morgan is much more like, this is a national championship winning program. Now, some people will laugh at that. Utah still has to win a Big 12 championship for even that to come to be, or get in the playoffs, which they haven't done yet. But I think it's his vision and the way that he talks about it. It feels much more approachable than just a pie in the sky. Like every coach has to say, yeah, we're going to win a national championship, right? Like Utah's not there yet. I think anybody can recognize that Utah's not quite there to that level. There's still a lot of investment. There's still a lot of things that have to happen within the program, but he's not shy about that. And I know it's subtle, but I think it's all about kind of how he approaches that in terms of what translates to success, right? And we'll see what that is. So with that being said, spring camp starts tomorrow. If you're listening to this on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever, it's going to be the same. But to me, these are some of the top storylines that I've come up with. That's not to say that they're perfect by any means, but this is the top storylines that I have come up with. Whoops, I am screwing up my. Sometimes you just do things and it just doesn't work. And for whatever reason, the computer doesn't want to work with me today. And so if you're watching on YouTube, there we go. We can kind of figure out how we're going to do this because I'm an idiot today. I'm trying to go through a different evolution in technology with my podcast, and it's a learning curve today. So it was working better last time, but here we are. So four spring storylines that I've identified, and look, there's more, right? Like you can come at me with other storylines, and I'll agree with you, disagree. I don't know what it is, but these are some pretty basic storylines that I want to see coming into this. And look, like spring isn't some earth-shattering moment that like suddenly the light bulb moment goes off. Maybe there's some of that, but I think these are kind of the things that is at play and are most paramount, that's kind of an oxymoron. It's just paramount to the program succeeding. And first off, I've got listed on there is Morgan Scalley taking over the reins. Now, I kind of already talked about that one, but it's really just kind of about him identifying and establishing his culture and plan. Now, he's been doing that since the end of December when he got named head coach, but now it's an opportunity to do that with real true practices in play, right? It's bringing in these new freshmen that have enrolled early. It's bringing in the transfers. It's bringing in the players that you've already got here and identifying what is successful. And he gave us some ideas of what is going to be the most pivotal, but I can't really share that right here. We'll try to get that on the record in the coming days. But it's nothing too earth-shattering, right? It's identifying players that are going to be impactful, and I bet you can guess where he's going to kind of go. But it's more just how does he establish himself, right? How does this spring go? Is it chaotic? Is it organized? Is there too much? Is there too little? Where is this going to be? And I don't know that you and I are necessarily going to get all the details on that because only the people in the program are really going to have a full sense of that. But I think it's more of just kind of how this is portrayed outside. What is happening? To me, I don't think it's going to be chaotic. I think he's a very organized individual, and I think he's going to have things done. I mean, he's been planning practices for years anyway, so I don't think there's going to be much deviation, if not for just some tweaks. So this is a storyline, but it's more just kind of, pretty basic stuff in terms of who's he going to be in spring. And then how does that transition to fall? There is an, pending NCAA vote that's happening here soon where the NCAA is trying to make it so that players can't just suddenly unenroll, right? You can't just suddenly unenroll and then go to another program as a walk-on or even be picked up by that team as a scholarship player. It's kind of the loophole outside of the transfer portal, which we've seen a few times, but there's still questions on what that can be. And I believe Ross Dellinger of Yahoo Sports has been all over this, so you can go into more detail there of kind of the explanation of how that is. But essentially, the vote is that if this passes, there is no unenrolling and picking up a player from another team that does that or poaching players that way. If you do, there's severe penalties for a coach and a program that does that. That includes, I believe it's a half a season suspension for the head coach. There's positions or roster spots taken away. That's their goal. Now, the biggest struggle here is that's going to get fought in court if this does pass. But the point being, there's still going to be some tentative stuff here going into spring about how players are talked about, how players are viewed simply because of that, right? It's pretty obvious that that's going to be a situation that's going to be the case just because you don't know if you can still have a player, right? The last thing you want to do is prop up some guy that's young and freshman and then they find a loophole where they unenroll and then come into another program. So, until that is settled by the NCAA and kind of the courts, whatever it may have you, I think you're still going to see a little bit more of a cautious approach from coaches, including Morgan Scalley, on how this approaches or how they approach spring, including spring games. Does Utah go with a spring game? My belief is that they aren't going to go with a spring game. That may be breaking news to some people, but my understanding is there's a high probability that they actually go away from a spring game this year. So part of that is simply trying to help manage that stuff, right? Until there becomes much more consistency in the NCAA, it's tough to want to showcase your best players or give any indication that, hey, this freshman may be popping off. It's a tough world that everybody lives in, and coaches are just trying to survive that. So there's that. Next is the coaching staff changes, right? You've got two new coordinators, Kevin McGivern and Colton Swan. Both have been their respective coordinators. Colton Swan at Weber State, Kevin McGivern most recently at Utah State. But now they're coming into Morgan Scalley's system. How did they gel with him? Do they have a lot of autonomy, or is it Scalley kind of dictating things? I'm going to guess that McGivern has much more of a say in his offense than Scalley, just simply because Scalley hasn't really gotten into the offensive side of the ball until now. But we'll see. How do they work together? This is an opportunity where they can come together and actually simulate it, right? And come together and see how it works. How much is that autonomy given to them versus how much does Scalley get involved? He's the head guy. He's the CEO. He has to be involved. But where does that go? Next, you've got a whole bunch of position coaches that are brand new to the program or returning to the program, a la Chad Bumpus. But how does that gel with Morgan Scalley as well? You've got Jordan Gross with an offensive line who not only is he new to the program, but he's also new to college, right? He's coming from the high school ranks where, there's a certain way of doing things there as the head coach versus now being a true dedicated position coach. How does that change for him? That's a big question. Then you've got Luke Wells at tight end. You've got Ryan Gunderson as a QB coach. You've got Anoke Brechterfield at the defensive ends. You got Derek Odom as a safeties coach. All of these guys have experience wherever they've been. So it's not like they're brand new coaches outside of Jordan Gross, but how do they all gel together? Are they in sync? Are they connected? Based on their rationale for coming to join Morgan Scalley, my belief is that they can. But you don't really know that until you get into the thick of it, right? You're on the field together, you get those pressure situations or even simulated pressures, and suddenly you're screaming at another guy because you don't like the way that he's doing things. Like, how does that work? So to me, the two top storylines here is Morgan Scalley and the coaching staff, simply because this is a brand new regime. So I feel like that's pretty safe, pretty simple, not going too outside of the box, but it also, it does matter. Then there's trench play. To me, this is where Utah is going to win or lose this next season. You've got a lot of returners on the offensive side. You've got a lot of returners on the defensive side. But where you're going to find that success is going to be in the trenches. And maybe this is another easy out, right? It's easy to say, oh, well, you need to be stacked on the offensive line, stacked on the defensive line. I don't think so. I mean, I think this is pretty standard, but at the same time, this year especially, offensive line loses two key components on the tackles, and then you lose an interior that is a completely veteran unit. Like, you can't just replicate that because you don't have it, right? Like, you don't have first-round tackles on the outside, and you don't have guys that have played for 4 or 5 years at Utah on the inside. Now, with that said, Utah does have talented players and guys that have been depth pieces for this program, but at the same time, it's how do they come together? And if the offensive line isn't coming together and there's problems, you're in a world of hurt. And so this is where Utah has to figure out the most what they're going to do, right? Can these guys get together? Can Kelvin Obot fit into that system, right, as a true freshman? How does they gel together? Where do positions fit, right? Is one player who is slated as a tackle better in guard? Can you get good snap down? Can you, there's so many things here where it's important to be able to get that chemistry early. And if Utah can find that chemistry early in spring with this offensive line in particular, I think they're going to be so much better in the fall. And I think Scalley is one that demands kind of understanding your craft and being the guy that, even if you're not the best player, you're kind of approaching it with confidence and understanding, look, you're going to make mistakes, but it's a learning opportunity. And so I think if you can find the 5 best guys that can do that, where they're giving their all, where they're doing everything for the program, and if there are problems, learning and correcting them, I think Utah can be okay. Now, that's pretty basic stuff, right? But I think it goes down to how Utah can succeed. They've got running backs that are returning that are great. You've got your quarterbacks that are great. You've got wide receivers that we're going to get to here in a second. but you've got all these pieces that in theory could make Utah better than they were last year, but you've got to make sure that offensive line will gel. Will it? We'll see. I'm really curious to see, what Jordan Gross says about his offensive line coming into spring and then how he approaches that coming out of spring. What development is done in the offseason as we get into fall and what happens there. But to me, that's going to be a big piece. And then defensive line, I'm not entirely worried about this unit. With that said, I think there's going to be some questions about it. And when we did the breakdown of each position, obviously the defensive tackle room is where things need to improve, but I don't think Utah's that far off, especially with kind of some of the things that we watched yesterday from Morgan Scalley. I think Utah, there's just certain things that if they can clean up, I think they're going to be okay, and they've got the guys to do it. Some of this is going to be a little bit more youth. You're going to have guys that maybe don't have the same experience that others have had, but if they can get that clicking as well, I think Utah's going to be in a fine spot, right? They always find guys that can do it. It's just a matter of being able to kind of piece it together. So it is a storyline, but I don't know it's going to be a major storyline, right? Like offensive line to me is much more impactful as a storyline in terms of what they can do coming into the spring than the defensive line. But look, they have to get it corrected. And if they don't get that corrected, it really sets up some failures on the defensive side, especially when Utah goes into its man coverage, right? Like you can't just have a mistake and then suddenly, guys break free. And we saw what happened at the Kansas State game and then a lesser part in the Kansas game, right? Like teams are going to try to maximize whatever mistakes that you have. And, Utah's got to clean that up. And every team's going to have areas of weakness. Like you can't avoid that. But I think it's trying to find the best approaches there. And then lastly, it's really just coming down to the quarterback and the wide receiver connections. Who are Devin Dampier and Bird Ficklen's connections, right? How are they integrated with these players? Where can they go? How is the passing in the spring? We know that Kevin McGivern likes to emphasize the pass a little bit more. What's that going to be now with his wide receivers? Who are the guys that step up? Obviously Braden Pagan and Kyrie Scholes come in and there's going to be a lot of expectations placed on them. But what can that mean with their connection with these players? Can they get the timing down? Can they understand what they need to do and be in sync with both of the quarterbacks? Like, to me, that's going to be a big thing. And I don't know that it's as big as last year. I think last year was a little bit more heavy with the wide receivers just because there was so much more uncertainty. But at the same time, I still think that is a big component, especially if McGivern wants to emphasize the pass. What does that do for this team? How can they, can they be efficient? But how can they move forward with this? Do they have the right guys to be able to do it? That kind of stuff. So, really fascinated with that and kind of moving on there. So with that, the next part of this is I want to, who are maybe some of the freshman game changers? Who are the guys that I'm going to look for coming into this? Now there could be a bunch. I'm not including transfers in this one yet, but freshmen in particular that are coming in. I've identified 3 players that I'm intrigued by, but that's not to say that others couldn't pop off and kind of showcase. But for me, obviously, number 1 is Kelvin Obot, 5-star offensive tackle that's coming in. Does he integrate into this offensive line? Can he get into that starting unit, a la Spencer Fano that first year, where you're going to take your lumps? He's not going to be a finished and polished product, but can he get in that line and be one of the guys that they trust, right? Is that what it's going to be where they can find an opportunity there? I don't know. We'll see. LaMarcus Bell. This is the running back out of Oregon. I'm really intrigued by what he can provide. I know Utah is really high on him, but can that now meet the expectations when he gets into practice? Where does he fit into that system? This is a position where if he's successful and he can be impactful in the game, he can get reps, right? I think, there's a couple guys ahead of him in terms of Steve Chavez Soto and Daniel Bray, but can he be, impactful on the field where maybe he becomes right where he's behind Wayshawn Parker, right? You're going to find the guy that can produce. And if it's a freshman, they're going to give it to him, right? But I'm curious to see what happens with him. And I'm intrigued on what he can do, but I feel like there's a lot of momentum trending in his favor where he can be a guy that can be pretty solid. And then one, he's a freshman, but he's a little older, and that's Davis Andrews. He's coming in off of his mission. There was a ton of excitement about him when he committed to Utah. What can he be for this program in his first year? Now, coming off of a mission is tough. We'll see if he's lost a step, to get those mission legs under him, whatever that may be that they say, where can he be? But I'm really intrigued to kind of see how he integrates with this team and what he's able to do. So that's going to be, one of the players that I'm looking at as well. So now looking at some players that names to watch, the first that I'm going to go with, and let's switch this graphic here, is Braden Pagan. This is simple, right? Like I'm not reinventing the wheel here with a couple of these players, but I really want to see the connection that Braden Pagan has with Devin Dampier. How can he integrate into this? Is he a true wide receiver one? If you're watching on YouTube, on the graphic that I have there, I show his ADOT, which is your average depth of target. That's 14.7, so about 15 yards, right? How can he be impactful for Utah in the intermediate, which was actually Devin's strongest suit? He's not necessarily a stretch the field and go downfield a ton, but what kind of impact can he have? How's his routes? Everything in that regard and what he's able to do. I'm really intrigued by that. Early accounts sound like, Braden is fitting in really well. He understands Kevin McGivern's offenses, and so it's going to be a natural fit there, assuming that Devin can kind of get that down and get it together. But I think, he's the odds-on favorite to be kind of your wide receiver one, assuming that other guys don't pop off. But I think this is his to lose, essentially. And what kind of player can he be? How impactful can he be? That I'm really curious to learn. And then there's Kyrie Scholes. Kyrie Scholes, second leading receiver at San Jose State last year. Similar player in terms of production. These two, how are they going to produce, right? Like, can they live up to the expectations that are being placed upon them coming into the season? Last year, that was Tobias Merriweather, right? And Larry Simmons, and I'll get to Larry in just a second. But Tobias Merriweather, he didn't live up to those expectations, right? He had the physical measurables to be able to be a top wide receiver in terms of what you're looking for, but it just didn't produce on the field. So what does that look like? So Braden Pagan and Kyrie Scholes, like I'm really intrigued by that. That's a really easy, natural names to throw out there. But I think, this is really going to hinge on Utah's success. If they can find guys that can be able to be effective in the receiving game, this completely changes this team because that they can run. You know that you got Wayshawn Parker back there. You've got your two dynamic quarterbacks that can do anything. Obviously, it's a different offensive line, but Devin Dampier's done it under worse offensive lines. Like, that they can run. That's a guarantee. But if you can find a lethal threat in the passing game, how much does that change for this team? And adding into that is going to be Larry Simmons. To me, quite honestly, I feel like this is a breakout season for Larry. Near the end of the season, he really started to get hot. He started to build a connection with Devin Dampier. You see he's got 280 yards and 6 touchdowns. I mean, Kyle Whittingham would call him Touchdown Larry because every time he got the ball, he scored a touchdown, it seemed like. So this is where I want to see kind of him take over. I think you've got a guy that is getting the confidence. He understands the system. Can he be more impactful in this program? He's got tremendous abilities. Toe tapping, he can go up and get the ball. I mean, there's a lot to love about Larry Simmons, but can he take that to the next level and be a consistent producer? To me, if he can do that, you've got a 3-headed monster right there that I think can do some serious damage. So those three, not even speaking to the other wide receivers in the room, but if you can get those three down, I think Utah's going to be in a very good situation coming out of spring. Next, we're going to go to Steve Chavez Soto. This is your running back out of San Jose State, leading rusher for the program. Now, they didn't rush it a ton, but he's a guy that proved that he could get it done, right? 448 yards, 7 touchdowns, really good grades in Pro Football Focus, especially in your offensive grade at 81.4, and then in his run grade at 80.9. So, he's good technician of the game. Really fascinated to see what that translates to in the Big 12. But I think you've got a guy that can be really effective for this squad and move forward. And then obviously LaMarcus Bell we talked about, but he's, we're going to put that in there as well. And then I'm really fascinated. Did I put this graphic in here? Where did it go? There it is. Noah Benny. He's been with Utah before, but I've heard a lot of positive things about his transition now from Weber State and what he can be as a tight end. Now, he's not necessarily going to be your top wide receiver type or pass catching tight end. He's going to be much more down in the dirt type guy, but he has the ability to catch. He has the ability to be able to be impactful in that way. And how does Utah utilize him? I see him as more of a Cole Fotheringham type player where you can get him passing opportunities, but he's really going to be a guy that is a sixth lineman, and gives Utah some flexibility that way for him to break out, be a pass catcher, or really just kind of add more bodies to the offensive line if they need to. But I've heard a lot of good things about him, and I'm really fascinated to see what happens with him. And then there's Isaiah Kema. He comes here not really getting a lot of opportunities at Ohio State in his first season. There's a belief that he is in contention for the starter at center. The numbers here, if you're looking on YouTube, it's hard to gauge because he had 31 total snaps at Ohio State. So you can't really get a full picture of who he can be. But I'm curious to see, what type of a player he can be, and can he beat out an Alex Harrison who has much more experience with Utah, but can he be a better player? I don't know. We'll see. But I think he's a guy you're going to want to pay attention to, and we're gonna see what happens there. Let's move on to Ethan Day, defensive end. North Texas guy, comes in, really solid producer, but still has a lot of upside. Had 53 tackles last year, 7 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. Really decent grades from Pro Football Focus. You'd like to see those improved. But I think you're starting at a really solid baseline. And if you can get, Brechterfield that can coach him up, what kind of player can he be? Can he crack the starting unit? There's other guys there that, have the kind of odds-on favorite to be the starter. But can Ethan Day break into that and be the guy that Utah can utilize at the defensive end position that can be disruptor, can be effective? What can he be? He clearly shows that he can get in the backfield, but can he do that at the Big 12 level? What can that be? I tend to believe that there's going to be a lot of belief that he can do it. It's just a matter of seeing it on the field and kind of getting it done. So he's a guy to watch. And then at the defensive tackle room, we got Jiramoe. This is a big body guy that comes in, didn't have a ton of reps when he was at San Jose State, but at the same time scored well in the defensive grades from Pro Football Focus with an 83.1, 28 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. So, can he be a guy that really attacks it? Can he break into that unit? Whether it's, Carson Kafusi or is it Pupu Sepulona, can you break in with those guys and be able to be a guy, or at least a part of the 2 deep? I'm really curious to see there. And then there's Jamal Wallace, similar situation. Guy came from Tennessee, just didn't have a lot of reps, had 4 tackles, but there really wasn't a lot to get from him at his time in Tennessee. So what can he do if he gets to Utah and maybe has a little bit more of a position available to him? Can he work and fight? He's a bigger body guy. Let's see, he's 6'3", 313. What can he be that kind of clogs up those lanes? And I think you're going to see a lot more bigger bodied guys under Morgan Scalley trying to clog up the lanes, but also being athletic dudes that can just kind of produce at the level that they need to. Can he be that guy? And then there's Lucas Samsula from Wyoming, another guy that, had good production, another guy that's, 6'4", 306, a big body, 15 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. What can he be? His tackling is one of the best of the group that's transferred in, but there's a lot to be desired in terms of his other grades. So where does he fit into this? Can he be a guy that fits in? But I think those 3, I'm putting in those 3 in the defensive tackle room as players to watch, because I simply want to know what that defensive tackle room is going to be like, right? Can they be impactful? Can they be starter caliber players? Can they be 2 deep players? Where are they going to be? And so for me, that's kind of where I'm curious what's going to go on there. And then there's Cyrus Polu at linebacker. I've heard a lot of positive things about him and kind of his ability. He had 14 tackles last year. Just didn't get a ton of playing time. It was much more special teams. But what can he be for this Utah squad? Especially as I don't want to say he's slated for a starting role, but I think there's expectations that he could be one of the starters. So what can we get from him? Is he a guy that complements Utah really well? Does he still have a lot to learn? Is Utah going to be thin here at linebacker and, they're just trying to work things through? Or is this a true talent opportunity where Utah's now, I wouldn't even say upgrading, but now moving on to the next iteration of that team? And I think, Colton Swan, I think you have to not doubt him at all. I think you can trust him. He finds guys that develop, that work hard, and he gets them in the best opportunities available. And I think Cyrus Polu is a guy that is kind of that next level. And then lastly, two other players. We're going to go with Elijah Reed. We talked about him a lot last week with the position breakdown. Really good grades on defense, run defense, pass rush, that kind of stuff. What can he be in the cornerback room? Can he get a starting role? Can he be impactful in a way that helps Utah? And then also James Chenault, similar situation there. Like, where do these two factor in, and kind of what happens there? So to me, that's where everything is going to kind of lay up. Those are kind of the players there. I can throw this graphic out there and say the biggest questions are trench play, wide receiver progress, and offensive scheme changes. How does this all fit? But overall, I think this is a team that's pretty well suited to connect last year's 11-2 season and kind of build from that. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to go undefeated or that they're going to, have a similar record. But I think if you can build on that in a way that sets you up, whether it's next year or this year, I think, this spring is going to be a good telltale of that. I think we got some of that last spring when Devin Dampier came in. I think there was just a vibe shift that kind of gives you that feeling, right? Like, and I don't know another way to say it. As a writer, like, I'm supposed to put that into words, but it's tough. Like, when you get around these players, it's just kind of, you can kind of sense the vibe of the team. And, last year you could feel it. You could feel that the team would be good. I get a similar sense about this team, but it's more the optimism around who Morgan Scalley could be. But I haven't gotten to see that yet, and I'm really fascinated to see what that is as you get around these players and kind of how they approach it, how they're talking about it, that kind of stuff. So really looking forward to it. I think this is a team that can be special, but I still think they've got some pieces that they need to work out. It's far from a guarantee, but I think it's a team that is not that far off either. So really fascinated to see how this goes. The schedule lays up well for Utah this year, but they've got to get it done in spring first. So we'll see what happens. I'm intrigued by it. I'm looking forward to going up to spring camp and seeing what happens, and we'll see what we get. Like, don't expect earth-shattering news, but at the same time, curious to see how it all comes together. So with that, we're going to sign off today. I appreciate you all for listening. And we'll get back after this with a little bit more spring stuff. So with that, we'll sign out. Have a great day.